They say the walls of Le Mans still whisper on certain nights when the lamps flicker and the air smells faintly of iron. The sound isn't the wind, it's the echo of a scream that never stopped. February 2nd, 1933. A night when civility itself tore its own face off. A lawyer came home to find his wife and daughter mutilated beyond recognition. Eyes gouged, skulls split, bodies left like torn paper dolls on the floor. But the most disturbing part wasn't the violence. It was who did it. Upstairs, two maids, quiet, dutiful sisters, lay side by side in bed. Calm. Their bodies still glistening with the blood of the women they served. When police burst in, the sisters didn't flee. They didn't even flinch. Christine looked up, her voice steady. It was us. That was all. No madness in her tone, just certainty. France called it the most senseless crime in modern history. But it wasn't senseless. It was something else. Something ancient, ritualistic, buried under the illusion of class and obedience. You're not about to hear a simple true crime story. You're about to descend into one of the most disturbing psychological collapses ever recorded. A story about power, control, mirrors, and what happens when the human mind becomes its own prison. So listen closely. Because what happened in that house was not random. It was the final act of a long-engineered madness. One born from a society that fed on silence and submission. A system that built monsters without realizing it. Long before that night, the Papin sisters, Christine and Leah, were already ghosts in their own lives. Abandoned by a mother who saw children as inconveniences, raised by institutions that valued obedience over affection, they were programmed to serve. But service is a slow poison. It doesn't kill you at once, it erases you, piece by piece, name by name, until only your reflection remains asking who yai. When the world gives you no God, you invent one. For Leah, that God was Christine. For Christine, it was the bond itself, a mirror so perfect it reflected only her own obsession back at her. When the crime happened, it wasn't planned. It was triggered, like a mechanism long wound by years of humiliation. A broken iron short-circuited, sparks flew, and Madame exploded in rage. Words became slaps, slaps became screams, and in that instant Christine snapped. Something primal overtook her, centuries of servitude compressed into one eruption of forbidden revolt. She tore out Madame's eyes first, not out of sadism, but symbolism, the eyes that had looked down on her, the gaze of power itself. Leah joined her without hesitation, not because she wanted to, but because she couldn't not. Her will had long been absorbed into Christine's. When it ended, the women upstairs were unrecognizable. The ones downstairs were unshaken. They cleaned the murder weapons, locked the doors, washed themselves, blew out the lights, then lay together in bed, waiting for discovery, as if this final act had completed them. When police asked why, Christine answered, "It was a divine act." Think about that. Not revenge, not anger, divinity. She saw it as a kind of sacred justice, the erasure of hierarchy, of control, of every gaze that had stripped her humanity away. This wasn't just a murder, it was a crack in the facade of civilization itself, exposing what happens when human beings are reduced to tools. The Papin sisters were not born monsters. They were manufactured by a world that demanded obedience, demanded invisibility, and then recoiled when that invisibility turned violent. But the deeper question isn't what they did, it's what they revealed. Because their story forces us to ask, how much of what we call sanity is just submission wearing perfume? And how close are you to the edge theirs? I crossed. You see, madness doesn't appear out of nowhere. It's built, brick by brick, silence by silence. And in Le Mans, 1933, the foundation finally cracked. Now the truth you've heard is only the surface. The real descent begins next, where obedience turns into worship and love becomes the most dangerous form of control ever recorded. They say when two people are isolated long enough, their minds begin to echo, thoughts merge, emotions synchronize, and eventually one becomes the reflection of the other until you can no longer tell where one ends and the other begins. That's what happened to Christine and Leah Papin. The world called it folie à deux, but that phrase doesn't capture what they truly became. This wasn't just shared madness, it was a fusion, two broken minds creating a single entity born of pain, repression, and absolute dependence. From the outside, their life looked ordinary, two servants in a respectable home, but inside that attic, reality had already begun to warp. They stopped speaking to others. They wrote no letters, made no friends, visited no one. The only words they heard came from each other, and in that vacuum, Christine's voice became law, her moods, her beliefs, her paranoia slowly replacing Leah's sense of self. Leah wasn't just obedient, she was dissolving. Every thought Christine spoke became her truth. Every emotion Christine felt became her own. When Christine hated Madame Lancelin, Leah felt that hatred burn in her chest. When Christine imagined the world as a prison, Leah believed they were inmates chained together. Psychologists would later say Leah lived inside Christine's delusion, but the truth is darker. Leah chose it. Because in Christine's shadow she felt something the world had never given her. Belonging. Think about that. A lifetime of being unwanted. By parents, by employers, by society. And suddenly there's one person who sees you completely, who claims you as their own, who tells you what to feel, when to breathe, when to exist. That kind of devotion isn't loyalty, it's worship, and worship is a form of surrender. Christine, on the other hand, fed on that surrender. Her love wasn't soft or maternal. It was controlling, possessive, absolute. She didn't just protect Leah, she absorbed her. To Christine, Leah wasn't a sister. She was a limb, an extension of her will. The idea of separation terrified her more than death. That's why every time Madame Lancelin hinted that one sister might be dismissed, Christine would shake with rage. She saw it as annihilation. And yet, something else festered in that attic, something taboo even in the eyes of the modern world. Rumors whispered that their bond crossed the boundaries of sisterhood. That affection blurred into something physical, secret, and forbidden. Whether true or not, the idea of it terrified society more than the murders themselves, because it meant that love, in its most desperate, unnatural form, had turned inward. They didn't need men, God, or family. They had replaced all of it with each other. But obsession cannot exist without opposition. And Madame Lancelin's cold authority became the perfect symbol of everything that stood between them and that twisted unity. To her, the maids were tools, extensions of order and cleanliness. To them, she was the face of control, the overseer who watched, who commanded, who broke their sense of self 100 times a day with tiny humiliations. Christine began to believe that Madame was poisoning them, spiritually, emotionally, perhaps even literally. She told Leah that the Madame's anger was an attack, that they were victims of some invisible force sent to separate them. Leah believed every word, and so their reality shifted again, from service to siege. Isolation does strange things to the mind. It distorts time, inflates fear, and turns ordinary gestures into threats. The clinking of a glass upstairs could feel like mockery. A whisper through the wall could sound like judgment. In that closed world, Christine and Leah started reading meaning into every sound. They believed they were being tested, watched, punished for reasons they couldn't name. And when the mind believes it is trapped long enough, it does what animals do in cages. It snaps. But snapping doesn't always look violent at first. Sometimes it looks like stillness. Long silences. Unblinking stares. Shared hallucinations whispered between breaths. Christine claimed to see visions. Lights, signs, omens in the shadows. Leah swore she saw them too. The delusion grew like a vine, curling around both their minds until reality disappeared beneath it. At night, Christine would whisper that their suffering had meaning, that their service was divine, their pain sacred. She began speaking of spiritual purity, of cleansing themselves from the corruption of the world above the stairs. The Lancelins were no longer employers. They were oppressors, demons wearing silk gloves. And when Leah repeated Christine's words back to her, Christine took it as proof. "You see it too," she'd say. "Then it must be true." Two voices became one echo. One echo became a doctrine, and that doctrine demanded release. When people later asked how two quiet maids could commit such savagery, psychiatrists argued theories. repressed trauma, psychosexual tension, class resentment, religious mania. But the truth is more intimate. They weren't trying to destroy Madame and Geneviève. They were trying to destroy the gaze, the thing that had watched them, judged them, owned them. That night, when Madame scolded Christine over a faulty iron, it wasn't about the iron. It was about years of invisible chains tightening all at once. Christine saw in Madame's eyes every insult, every dismissal, every reminder that she was less than human. And in that moment, something inside her inverted. The servant became the judge. The oppressed became the executioner. It's easy to condemn madness from the outside. Harder when you realize it's not an alien force, it's human logic pushed too far. Christine and Leia's reality was built by the people who ignored them. Their crime was simply the system turning back on itself. You might think you'd never be capable of such darkness, but if you were stripped of love, identity, and freedom long enough, if your only mirror was another broken soul reflecting your pain back at you, tell me, how far before you'd lose the distinction between devotion and destruction? Because in the end, the Papin sisters didn't descend into madness. They climbed toward what they thought was freedom, and mistook hell for heaven. And as we move deeper, you'll see how society itself fed that transformation. The elite, the church, the press, all took turns rewriting the crime into what they wanted it to mean. But what they really feared wasn't the blood, it was the reflection. It began, as most revolutions do, in silence. February 2nd, 1933. A night so ordinary it almost mocked the storm it was about to conceal. The lamps of Le Mans burned low through the fog, and the narrow streets echoed with the steady drip of winter rain. In the Lancelin house, the rhythm of servitude was unbroken. Dishes washed, linen ironed, the clock's heartbeat repeating its endless command. Obey, obey, obey. Christine and Leia had spent the day as they always did, invisible, polishing the brass rails of a staircase that never carried them anywhere, ironing dresses they'd never wear, listening to the murmurs of their employers as though overhearing the voices of gods. But underneath that quiet, something ancient was moving, an accumulation of centuries of servitude pressing toward the surface. At dusk, Madame Lancelin and her daughter Geneviève were expected home from errands in town. Monsieur Lancelin was away at his club, leaving the house in the sisters' control. For a brief moment, they were the only souls inside the great house, two maids standing in the quiet hum of their labor. And that's when the iron sparked. The fuse blew with a violent hiss. The room fell into darkness. The sudden silence was almost sacred, a vacuum where something holy and terrible could emerge. Christine froze, staring into the blackness, her face lit only by the faint glow of a dying ember. Then she whispered, "She'll punish us for this." To anyone else, it would have been an inconvenience, but to the Papin sisters, it was a verdict. Years of discipline had trained them to expect wrath for every imperfection. They stood motionless in that dark kitchen, their breath shallow, as if waiting for judgment itself to descend through the ceiling. And then came the sound, the door opening, heels clicking across marble. Madame's voice, sharp and familiar, slicing through the air like the crack of a whip. "Christine, Leia, what have you done now?" Something in Christine snapped. Her body stiffened, her eyes wide, not with fear but revelation. Leia saw it too, though she couldn't explain what she saw. Christine moved first, her hands trembling, her voice low and trembling with something feral. "If she touches us again, I'll kill her." Madame's footsteps approached, followed by Geneviève's lighter ones. The candlelight trembled on the wall, catching the silver of the kitchen knife in Christine's hand. There was no plan, only instinct, raw, primitive, volcanic. Madame's voice rose again. "You've ruined the fuse, you stupid—" The rest never finished. Christine struck. The first blow landed across Madame's face, then another. Geneviève screamed, and Leia, trembling, weeping, lunged forward to help her sister. The two maids became a single force, a whirlwind of fear, rage, and something beyond both. Madame fell first, her skull striking the corner of the table. Geneviève tried to flee, but Leia caught her by the hair. They used everything, the pewter jug, the hammer, their bare hands. But the most haunting detail was this: they gouged out the eyes of both women. as if removing the gaze that had defined them their entire lives. Those eyes, those instruments of surveillance, judgment, power, no longer existed. When the storm quieted, the room was unrecognizable. Silence fell again, thicker than before. The sisters stood in the wreckage of their servitude, panting, covered in blood and fragments of porcelain. Christine dropped the knife. Leah sobbed, trembling, and then Christine turned to her. Her face, streaked with blood and tears, softened. "It's over," she whispered. "We're free." But freedom was not what entered that room next. What entered was stillness, the kind that follows a ritual. Christine looked around and began methodically cleaning. She washed their hands. When they removed their aprons, they locked the doors. Every movement precise, reverent, as if they weren't hiding a crime but performing a ceremony. Then together they climbed the stairs to their attic room, that narrow, airless sanctuary where years of repression had fermented. They removed their blood-soaked clothes, folded them neatly, and lay down side by side in bed. Leah asked in a whisper that barely existed, "What will happen now?" Christine smiled faintly. "God will forgive us. We did what was meant to be done." That was how the police found them hours later. Not hiding, not afraid, but waiting in silence, like penitents after confession. The crime below had been biblical in its cruelty, yet the scene above was almost serene. The horror wasn't in their violence, it was in their calm. When asked why, Christine said only, it was a divine act, and perhaps in a way she believed it. For to her, the murders were not rebellion, they were purification, the destruction of the eyes that had enslaved them, the symbols of power they could no longer endure, but what Christine called divine, the world called insane. Newspapers across France screamed headlines of servant madness and sisters of blood. Intellectuals debated whether this was class warfare, hysteria, or some new psychological phenomenon. Sartre, Lacan, and Beauvoir would later use their case as a mirror to French society itself. The perfect allegory of power turned inward, obedience turned monstrous. And yet what haunted them all wasn't the philosophy, it was the quietness. The image of two ordinary women, small and soft-spoken, lying peacefully in bed, while downstairs the bodies of their masters decomposed in the warmth of the lamp. That contrast, calm and carnage, revealed something primal about human nature. When the oppressed finally revolt, they don't scream, they whisper, and the whisper that echoed through Le Mans that night was this: "We were seen too much, and never seen at all." Now the murders were done, but the story was not over. Because what happened next, the trial, the confessions, the strange unraveling of Christine's mind, would expose something even darker. Not just the breakdown of two sisters, but the moral collapse of an entire society pretending it didn't create them. You're about to see what happens when guilt becomes spectacle, when madness becomes theater for the civilized world to feed upon. But before we descend further, write this in the comments twice. I see what they were never allowed to see. Because once you understand what the Papin sisters revealed, you can't unsee it. By the time Christine and Leah Papin were led into the courtroom, France had already turned their names into a myth. The newspapers called them the monsters of Le Mans. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, jostling for position, sketching their faces as if capturing some strange new species. But when the sisters finally appeared, the world gasped, because there were no monsters, just two small women, pale and trembling, dressed in plain black dresses, heads bowed like children on the way to confession. The silence in that courtroom was heavier than prayer. Behind it sat the whole machinery of class and morality: judges, priests, psychologists, journalists. Every layer of French society stacked neatly above the very thing it feared: the idea that obedience, when pushed too far, turns divine rage. Christine sat straight, eyes distant. Leah clung to her arm like a child to her mother. When asked to state her name, she hesitated, glancing at Christine before answering. It was as if she couldn't remember who she was, unless her sister told her. The room watched in fascinated horror as this invisible tether between them revealed itself again and again. A look, a whisper, a flinch that showed where one mind ended and the other began. The prosecutor's voice cut through the stillness. "Do you deny your crime?" Christine didn't blink. "No," she said. "We did what was right." Leah began to cry. The prosecutor pressed on, demanding motive, logic, reason. But reason had long since dissolved. Christine explained in calm, precise detail how Madame Lancelin had insulted them, how the light went out, how she felt something holy command her to strike. Her tone never wavered. She spoke as though describing a cleansing, not a murder. When the judge interrupted, calling her delusional, she turned to him and said, "You can't understand. You are one of them." In that single moment, the courtroom cracked. Because she wasn't talking about individuals, she was talking about a system. The world of the masters, the overseers, the civilized. She had given their unspoken class war a voice, and that voice frightened them more than the blood ever could. Psychiatrists called it folie à deux, a shared psychosis, one mind infecting another like a contagion. But that explanation was too neat, too comfortable. It framed the sisters as a medical anomaly rather than what they were, products of a structure that consumed the weak and demanded they smile while it did. The defense argued insanity. The prosecution demanded death. But underneath their polished words, the trial became theater. An exorcism of guilt for a society pretending its own cruelty was civilized. Every witness who took the stand spoke of the sisters' quiet obedience, their diligence, their isolation. No one asked why two women had to live like shadows to survive. When the photographs of the crime scene were shown, the audience gasped, not because of the gore, but because the violence had meaning. The eyes torn from their sockets were no longer random. They were symbols, the destruction of the gaze of power. A message to the entire order of servitude that said, "We will no longer be seen by those who see us as less than human." Christine's demeanor began to shift as the trial went on. At first she appeared composed, almost detached, but then came the breakdowns. When Leah was separated from her in prison, Christine began to scream. She tore at her hair, clawed her own body, and begged to see her sister. Guards found her rocking in her cell, whispering to shadows. When finally reunited during questioning, she clung to Leah with such ferocity that officials had to pry them apart. Witnesses claimed she kissed her sister's face, murmuring, "We are one soul. They can't divide us." The press twisted those moments into scandal. Whispers spread that the sisters' relationship had crossed into the unspeakable, that their crime was not just physical but moral, a violation of nature itself. Society needed that story. It made the horror easier to understand, easier to condemn. Two mad sisters, corrupted by isolation and forbidden love, that narrative allowed the audience to leave the courtroom feeling safe again, reassured that evil was rare, exotic, and separate from them. But that was the lie. The Papin sisters were not rare. They were the logical result of a world that demanded silence from the poor and submission from women. A world that stripped people of identity until the only way left to exist was through rebellion or madness. When the verdict came, it fell like a stone. Christine, death by guillotine. Leah, 10 years of hard labor. The courtroom applauded as if justice had been restored, as if civilization had conquered chaos. But what they celebrated was not justice. It was amnesia. Months later, Christine's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. But by then, she had already begun to unravel completely. Without Leah, her mind decayed. She refused food, spoke to walls, and claimed her soul had left her body. She died in an asylum a few years later, hollow-eyed, a ghost wearing the shell of what had once been defiance. Leah, released after only 8 years, vanished into obscurity. Some said she joined a convent. Others claimed she lived under another name until the 1980s, alone and silent, as if still trapped in that attic. The world moved on. Philosophers dissected their case, artists painted their faces, playwrights turned their crime into metaphor. But the true horror of the Papin sisters wasn't what they did, it was what they revealed. That beneath the polished veneer of society lies a machine powered by obedience. And when that machine breaks, when the servants revolt, the masters call it madness. So ask yourself, what if madness is not the sickness, but the cure? What if Christine and Leia didn't lose their minds at all, but finally reclaimed them? Because sometimes the most dangerous act in a world built on control is to see clearly. And those who see clearly are always the first to be called insane. After the trial, France tried to bury the Papin sisters beneath headlines and verdicts, but the intellectuals would not let them rest. The case refused to die because it was never just about two maids and two murders. It was about what happens when the human soul is stripped of power, language, and recognition. The elite called them insane. The philosophers called them revelation. Jean-Paul Sartre saw in them the perfect metaphor for bad faith, a world where people live as objects in other people's realities, pretending to choose when every choice is already decided by their position in society. Christine and Leia, he argued, were not merely criminals. They were mirrors reflecting the sickness of a civilization that worshipped hierarchy and control. He said their act was the moment when the other stopped being invisible and became unbearable. Jacques Lacan took it further. He called it the psychosis of the mirror. In his writings, the Papin sisters became the symbol of what happens when identity dissolves, when a person cannot tell where they end and another begins. Leia had no self outside Christine. She lived in what Lacan called the imaginary order, a world of reflections without separation, and Christine, unable to exist without that reflection, collapsed the boundary between love and possession. Together, they created a psychic loop, a two-person madness so complete it became its own universe. Simone de Beauvoir saw something even more haunting. She argued that society itself drove women to this kind of collapse. In The Second Sex, she wrote that women under patriarchy were never allowed to become full subjects. They were forced into roles of obedience, reflection, and silence. To her, the Papin sisters were not monsters. They were symbols of what happens when women are denied personhood for too long. Their rebellion, though horrific, was the logical co-end. A sequence of lives lived entirely in service to others. Think about that. The philosophers weren't defending their crime. They were dissecting the system that made it inevitable. The Papin sisters' madness wasn't personal. It was structural. It was the madness of the invisible, the rage of the unheard, the spiritual breakdown that comes when your existence is defined entirely by the will of someone else. And yet, even in death, Christine and Leia were not granted the dignity of being understood. Society made them into spectacle, plays, films, gossip, art. The surrealists loved them because they blurred the line between devotion and destruction. Jean Genet, the outlaw poet, turned their story into The Maids, a fever dream where servitude becomes theater, and the oppressed rehearse their own murders every night in ritual repetition. He understood what the newspapers missed, that the Papin case wasn't about insanity, it was about identity. Imagine living in a world where every day you clean up the traces of other people's lives, but none of your own. Where every movement, every word, is controlled, corrected, commanded. You begin to vanish, and when you look in the mirror, what stares back isn't you. It's the reflection of those you serve. Christine and Leia stared into that mirror too long, and one night they shattered it. But here's the truth no philosopher dared to say outright, what if the shared madness wasn't between two women, but between them and the world? What if society itself is infected with a collective psychosis, one that rewards obedience and punishes awakening? You see it everywhere. People trapped in systems they didn't build. Workers smiling through humiliation, families wearing masks to keep appearances, everyone playing their part, terrified of breaking the illusion. The Papin sisters simply stopped playing, and the moment they did, the mask of civilization slipped, revealing the primal truth beneath: domination and survival. The upper class recoiled not because of the violence, but because it saw itself in the reflection. The entire order of control trembled at the thought that the servants might wake up and remember they were human. That's why the philosophers clung to the case, because it wasn't just about crime or psychology, it was about the architecture of consciousness itself. Who owns your mind? Who defines your worth? Who decides what's sane and what's not? Christine and Leia broke every invisible rule that kept society in place. They didn't revolt through politics or protest, they revolted through madness. And that's what made them so terrifying, because madness, when it's absolute, cannot be controlled. Lacan once wrote that madness is the truth of the world, stripped of its mask. The Papin sisters forced that mask to fall. They made the polite society of France confront its own reflection, a reflection so ugly that it had to be locked away, diagnosed and dismissed. But what if they weren't sick? What if their minds were simply too raw to survive in a world built on lies? Because when you strip away all pretense, what remains? The same thing that drove Christine and Leia, the desperate need to be seen, to exist, to not vanish into someone else's story. And isn't that the same hunger that drives every man in this world of mirrors? We live in a century of illusions, political, religious, social, all designed to keep you obedient, to convince you that peace comes from compliance. But beneath the surface there's a voice whispering, "Wake up." The same voice Christine heard before the lights went out. The same voice that turns servants into revolutionaries and quiet hearts into weapons. That voice isn't madness. It's memory. The buried memory of your own freedom. The Papin sisters didn't create that voice. They simply stopped ignoring it, and for that the world called them insane. But look closely. How many of us live in prisons just as small, just as silent, just as invisible? How many of us obey systems that would rather see us broken than awake? You don't need to commit violence to revolt. You just need to see clearly and refuse to bow. And once you see, you can't unsee. That's why this story still haunts the world nearly a century later, because it's not about them anymore. It's about us. The trial ended, the philosophers moved on, and history tried to seal the case in books. But somewhere, in the quiet corners of every system that demands obedience, the Papin sisters still whisper, "We saw what you tried to hide, and now so have you." They called it folie à deux, madness shared by two. But if you look around now, a century later, you'll see it everywhere. Only now it's not two sisters in an attic. It's billions of people inside a digital house of mirrors, each one reflecting and amplifying the other's delusions until truth itself dissolves. You wake up, and before your feet touch the floor, your mind belongs to something else. Notifications, deadlines, images, commands, invisible hierarchies telling you what to want, what to fear, what to post, what to become. You obey without noticing. You serve without chains. And like the Papin sisters, you confuse obedience for purpose. That's the new folie à deux, not between individuals, but between humanity and its own reflection. The same psychological machinery that trapped Christine and Leia still operates, only now it's perfected, industrialized, digitized. You no longer need a Madame Lancelin watching from the staircase. The gaze is everywhere. The algorithm sees you more completely than any master ever could. And like Christine, part of you loves it, because being watched feels like being seen. That's the sickness, and that's the genius of it. In 1933, the Papin sisters were invisible, their madness born of silence. Today, the new servants live in permanent visibility. Cameras, metrics, followers, performance reviews. The surveillance has become social, the obedience voluntary, the chains made of dopamine and fear of irrelevance. The digital age didn't cure the sickness of control, it refined it. It turned servitude into identity, and you can feel it every time you scroll. That same psychic split, that same yearning to be seen and terror of being seen too clearly. We are all the sisters now, cleaning, performing, polishing the mirrors of a system that feeds on our reflection. Do you see it yet? The Papin sisters' attic was small, suffocating and silent. Ours stretches across continents, glowing in every screen, and like them, we lie awake inside it, whispering to our reflections, hoping the echo answers back. Christine's madness was not born of hallucination. It was born of overexposure. Every day, she lived beneath the gaze of power, stripped of privacy, reduced to performance. That's what every system of control understands. Surveillance doesn't just watch you, it creates you. The more you are observed, the less you belong to yourself. Now imagine that multiplied across billions of lives. The world has become one great Le Mans household, polite on the surface, predatory beneath. The masters are invisible now. Their commands come through screens, metrics, trends, and the servants smile as they obey, believing they are free because the cage is decorated with choice. Leia's submission was quiet, instinctive, absolute. Ours is elegant, algorithmic, disguised as convenience. You don't hear the commands anymore, you feel them, in the hunger for approval, the terror of missing out, the compulsion to stay visible, relevant, compliant. You build your own prison and call it progress. That's the real inheritance of the Papin sisters. They weren't the end of something. They were the beginning, the first visible fracture in the architecture of obedience, the first scream that said, "I am not your reflection." But here's the difference. The sisters snapped. You don't have to. The system you live in doesn't need violence to control you. It only needs your attention. It doesn't want your death. It wants your participation. Every click, every scroll, every reaction, a little drop of submission disguised as self-expression. You're told that madness is losing touch with reality. But what if reality itself has become the madness? A constant flood of mirrors reflecting mirrors, 1,000 opinions screaming truth until truth itself drowns. The same psychological loop that consumed Christine and Leia has scaled to the species. Two people shared a delusion and killed their masters. Today, billions share a delusion and worship theirs. The Papin sisters believed they heard the voice of God commanding them to act. You hear it too. Only now it speaks through headlines, influencers, corporations, governments, and feeds. The modern deity doesn't punish you. It seduces you. It keeps you scrolling, buying, obeying, distracted, until you no longer remember what silence sounds like. And silence was where the sisters finally met themselves. That's why their story still burns, because deep down, every man feels the same fracture. The part of you that obeys and the part of you that resents it, the part that smiles when you want to scream, the part that lives for validation while longing for freedom. That tension is the true folie à deux, the war between your conditioned mind and your buried will. Christine chose madness over submission. She tore down the illusion, even if it destroyed her. You don't need to follow her path, but you do need to understand her warning. When you build your identity on obedience, the day will come when the obedience eats the identity. And when that day arrives, when your own reflection looks back at you and no longer blinks, you'll hear her whisper again from that attic in Le Mans. It's over. We're free. But freedom is never given. It's taken. And it begins in the mind. So look around you. Every system that tells you who you are, what to want, what to fear, it's Madame Lancelin in another form. Every algorithm, every brand, every creed that demands your devotion is just another gaze you were never meant to meet. The question is no longer whether you're a servant. It's whether you'll ever stop serving. Because in the age of mirrors, rebellion doesn't begin with violence. It begins with refusal, with remembering who you are before the world taught you to bow. And when you remember, when you finally stop performing for the gaze, the reflection will shatter. And in that moment you'll see what Christine saw before the lights went out. Not madness, not rage, clarity. Every civilization begins with control. It's the first law of order. The only difference between a prison and a society is that in one, the bars are visible. In the other, they're written into your beliefs. The Papin sisters lived in a literal hierarchy. The masters upstairs, the servants below, but the structure that crushed them never vanished. It evolved. It spread into governments, corporations, churches, schools, armies, and over time, it became invisible. What began as a household dynamic, the overseer and the obedient, scaled into the architecture of the modern world. The 20th century perfected it. Bureaucracy replaced chains, management replaced monarchy, faith became marketing, and what the sisters experienced in their attic, that claustrophobic obedience to unseen masters, became the condition of the average citizen. You see, institutions learned from history's mistakes. They no longer demand your loyalty with fear. They earn it through dependence. The modern master doesn't shout. He provides. He gives you stability, convenience, identity. He feeds you just enough to make you grateful, distracts you just enough to keep you docile. That's the machinery of civilization, control disguised as care. The government tells you it protects you. The corporation tells you it empowers you. The church tells you it saves you. But every promise hides a condition: obedience. Submit to the system, follow the code, worship the symbol. In return, you're granted belonging, safety, purpose. It's the same exchange the Papin sisters were offered: work, obedience, shelter, but the price was their souls. Now look around. That same transaction repeats on a global scale every day. You give your time to the corporation, your faith to the government, your attention to the feed, and in exchange, they give you a sense of meaning, just enough to keep you from asking who benefits from your labor, your belief, your silence. They remind us that every institution, no matter how sacred, is built on fear. The fear that one day the servants will stop playing the part, and that's the moment the machine trembles. So, ask yourself, how many of your beliefs are truly yours? How many of your fears were planted in you by design? The Papin sisters showed the cost of awakening without guidance, but the greater danger is never awakening at all. Because once a man stops asking why he obeys, the machine no longer needs guards. He becomes his own warden, and when the entire world becomes its own warden, when everyone polices themselves for fear of being seen as strange, dangerous, or ungrateful, that is not civilization. That is captivity with better lighting. Christine and Leah were locked in their attic, watched by their masters. You are locked in your mind, watched by systems that call themselves freedom. The only question left is, which prison will you choose to escape from first? Every system of control has one ultimate goal: not to chain the body, but to erase the soul, because a body in chains can still dream. But a soul that forgets itself will obey forever. That was the final tragedy of the Papin sisters. Not that they went mad, but that the world made them forget who they were long before the murders ever happened. Think of it, two young women who never owned a mirror that showed their faces, only reflections of their masters. Two human beings who were never allowed to say "I," only "Yes, madame." They cleaned the footprints of others until they vanished beneath them. Their dreams became stains to be scrubbed out. Their voices became silence mistaken for virtue. That's what obedience does. It doesn't destroy you all at once. It dissolves you, drop by drop, until there's nothing left to save. You've seen it too, in workplaces, in families, in nations. Watch a man serve long enough and you'll see it. His eyes fade. The spark that once made him unique, replaced by the dull rhythm of duty. His words become slogans, his thoughts become protocols, his passions replaced with schedules. That's not survival, that's slow annihilation. The modern world calls it professionalism, maturity, social order, but look closely, it's the same ritual Christine and Leah lived through. The ritual of becoming useful at the cost of being real. Every institution that wants obedience must first separate you from your essence. The church tells you your desires are sin. The state tells you your defiance is danger. The corporation tells you your worth is productivity. Each message chisels away at the soul until what's left is a shape they can control. And when you forget your shape, when you no longer remember the sound of your own truth, that's when you vanish. Not physically, but spiritually. You become a role, a title, a task. You become replaceable. That's what happened to the Papin sisters. They were replaceable in every household they served. No one asked about their dreams, only their duties. No one saw them as women, only as labor. They were paid for their obedience and punished for their humanity. Until one night, that buried humanity fought its way back up, wild, violent, and starved. When Christine tore at her mistress's eyes, it wasn't madness in the medical sense. It was the soul remembering itself for the first time. It was identity breaking through the cement of servitude. It's horrifying because it's true. When the human spirit is suppressed too long, it doesn't awaken gently, it erupts. And yet, in our time, that eruption rarely comes. The system has learned to prevent it. It keeps you sedated, not with fear, but with distraction. It doesn't need to forbid you from dreaming. It only needs to flood your mind with noise until you forget what dreams even feel like. Obedience has become invisible now. It wears the mask of normalcy. You follow trends. You chase validation. You live inside narratives written by strangers, and you call it freedom because you can choose between 1,000 cages. The Papin sisters had one attic. You have an entire world designed to make you love yours, and that is the disappearance of the soul. Not dying, but dissolving quietly into routine. You see it in the eyes of people who once wanted to create, to build, to question. Now they scroll, they nod, they comply. They say what is safe, they love what is permitted. They repeat what they're told and call it thinking. Their rebellion is aesthetic, their passion curated, their individuality algorithm approved. That's not evolution, that's spiritual taxidermy. The soul isn't loud, it doesn't demand attention, it whispers. And the machine knows this. That's why it fills your world with noise, because silence is where you hear yourself, and hearing yourself is the first act of defiance. Christine and Leia were isolated, but they found silence. And in that silence they heard the scream of something ancient, the part of every human that cannot stand to be invisible, the part that remembers freedom even after centuries of obedience. You have that same voice. You've just been taught to ignore it. Every advertisement, every screen, every ideology tells you what to want, so you never have to ask who you are. That's how the soul disappears, not by death, but by substitution. You stop seeking meaning and start collecting symbols of meaning. Money, followers, status, applause, all of it borrowed purpose, none of it yours. That's why the Papin sisters terrify us even now. Bika. They remind us what happens when the soul, denied expression, forces its way back through the cracks. It comes not as light, but as fire. It burns everything false in its path. And that's what civilization fears most. Not chaos, but authenticity. Because a person who remembers themselves cannot be controlled. The disappearance of the soul is the quiet apocalypse, the one no one notices. A world of people who smile, work, and comply while their inner worlds turn to ash. You see it in cities full of motion but no meaning, in eyes lit by screens but empty inside, in voices that echo 1,000 borrowed opinions but never their own. That's why the story of Christine and Leia is not a relic, it's prophecy. They were not just two servants who killed their masters. They were the warning. When identity is erased long enough, humanity will reclaim itself. Violently, if it must. But you don't need to reach that point. You can reclaim yourself in silence, by remembering what you once wanted before the world told you what was acceptable, by speaking the words you've swallowed for years, by refusing to let comfort replace consciousness, because that's how the soul returns, not in noise, but in truth. And when the soul comes back, obedience ends. The masters tremble not because you rebel, but because you remember. And that memory, that flash of inner recognition, is the beginning of freedom. Not the kind they give you, the kind you take. There is a moment, quiet, terrifying, irreversible, when obedience dies. It doesn't happen with protest, it doesn't happen with rage, it happens with realization. A single thought that shatters centuries of conditioning. I don't belong to them. That is the forbidden awakening. The moment when the servant stops identifying with the system that made him, the moment the reflection refuses to reflect. For the Papin sisters, that moment came in the flicker of a broken light bulb. The night the power went out. In that brief darkness, Christine saw the invisible structure collapse. No madame. No master. No gaze. Just silence. And in that silence, she heard the truth. She had never been living her own life. She had been performing in someone else's dream. That realization was unbearable, and yet liberating, because once you see the illusion, you cannot go back to believing it. But awareness has a price. It destroys comfort. It erases certainty. It exposes the terrible truth that the world is built on obedience, and that your submission is the currency that keeps it alive. That's why every empire, every government, every corporation, every dogma fears awakening more than rebellion. Rebellion they can crush. Awareness they cannot. Because awareness doesn't need weapons. It spreads through perception, silent, contagious, unstoppable. The forbidden awakening is not a revolution of crowds, it's a revolution of consciousness. It begins when one person, you, stops participating in the illusion. The system survives by convincing you that you need it. It feeds on your fear of the unknown, your fear of being alone. That's why obedience is always wrapped in belonging. The Papin sisters obeyed not because they were weak, but because the alternative was unthinkable. Isolation, starvation, exile. Their masters didn't need to threaten them. The threat was the world outside the gate. Modern man faces the same invisible gate. You don't serve a mistress with a cane anymore. You serve systems of convenience, expectation, reputation. You serve to belong. You serve to be seen. But deep down, the same tension lives in you that lived in Christine. The conflict between safety and selfhood, between silence and truth, between comfort and freedom. The forbidden awakening begins when you stop fearing that conflict and start listening to it. Because the pain you feel when your life doesn't fit you isn't failure. It's the soul knocking from the inside. It's the part of you that refuses to die quietly. And make no mistake, every man has that part. The institutions spend lifetimes trying to bury it under labels: professionalism, maturity, responsibility, morality. They dress submission in noble language so you'll protect your own cage. But that hunger you feel, that quiet unrest you can't explain, that's your Christine. That's the part of you that still remembers what freedom feels like. The forbidden awakening doesn't come in chaos, it comes in stillness, in the quiet recognition that your life is not truly yours if every thought, every desire, every belief was taught to you by those who profit from your obedience. When that realization dawns, the world around you doesn't change, but the meaning of everything in it does. The master's voice becomes noise, the rules become optional, the fear becomes absurd. That's the moment you cross the invisible threshold, the point of no return. You can keep playing your role, saying your lines, smiling for the audience, but deep down, you know. You've seen the script, and once you've seen it, performance becomes impossible. That's why awakening feels like madness to the unawakened. It breaks the shared dream. It exposes the truth that society is not reality. It's agreement, and once you stop agreeing, you no longer exist in their world. That's what happened to Christine and Leia. They woke up, but they had no language for it. No guidance, no mentor to channel the fire. Their awakening came raw, untamed, and fatal. But it was still awakening. You have the same fire. The difference is what you'll do with it. If you repress it, it will rot inside you until it turns to resentment. If you unleash it blindly, it will burn everything, including yourself. But if you discipline it, if you feed it awareness, silence, strength, it becomes power. The forbidden awakening is not about rejecting the world, it's about seeing it clearly and refusing to kneel before its illusions. That's the stage the Papin sisters never reached. They broke the mirror but couldn't step beyond it. They destroyed the reflection, but not the idea behind it. Their act freed their bodies but not their minds. Your task is the opposite. To free your mind while leaving the world intact, to rise above the illusion without becoming consumed by it, to awaken without destroying, to see without going mad. That's what makes this path so dangerous, because once you begin to see, you will realize how much of your life was never truly lived, how many of your dreams were pre-approved, how many of your fears were given to you like gifts, and when you see that, you'll want to burn it all down, but don't. That's what the system expects. It thrives on chaos. What it cannot survive is calm rebellion, awareness without destruction, strength without spectacle. That's the true forbidden act, to awaken and remain still, to see the system, to play within it, but never be owned by it, to walk among the obedient and smile, knowing you're no longer one of them. That's what freedom looks like when it matures, and that's what every power fears. A man who obeys outwardly, but kneels to no one inwardly, because that man cannot be ruled. That man has remembered what the Papin sisters only glimpsed, the ungovernable truth of human will. That's the awakening they tried to bury in 1933, but history doesn't bury truth. It hides it in plain sight, waiting for you to see. There's a photograph, grainy, fragile, taken years after the murders. It shows Leia Papin alone, older, grey and silent. She's sitting by a window, her eyes turned away from the camera. There's nothing monstrous about her anymore, just a faint emptiness, a hollow peace. She's survived her sister, survived the trial, survived the century. But look closer. Her face doesn't show freedom, it shows erasure. This is what happens when the system wins. The fire burns out, and what remains is ash that remembers the flame. The world never forgot the Papin sisters, but not for the reasons it pretended. The newspapers said their story was about madness, class, female hysteria, but it wasn't. It was about something far more dangerous. What happens when ordinary people begin to see? Every institution needs its myths. The story of the obedient servant who stays silent, the loyal worker who never questions, the believer who never doubts. But the Papin sisters broke that myth. They proved that even the most invisible soul can awaken. And that's what terrified the world. Because once you realize how thin the walls of control really are, the whole structure trembles. That's why they made an example of them. Christine died in a psychiatric ward, declared insane, a label that lets the world stay innocent. Leia was hidden away, forgotten. Their awakening was reduced to a medical case, their rebellion sterilized into diagnosis. Folie à deux. Two women lost in delusion, easy to name, easy to dismiss. But history's labels are masks. They cover what society doesn't want to see. And what this story really shows is that the most dangerous revolution begins inside the mind, because the moment you stop seeing yourself as property of your job, your government, your religion, your reflection, you become something the system can't process. An anomaly, a free soul, and the machine has no category for freedom. It can only call it madness. Look at the world now. Look at how it reacts to anyone who refuses the screeds. Papin, the artist who creates without permission, the thinker who questions sacred institutions, the worker who refuses to sell his time for meaning, the believer who walks away from doctrine to find truth alone. What happens to them? They're isolated, mocked, pathologized, silenced, because every era has its attics, every century hides its awakeners. Christine's attic was in Le Mans, yours is inside your skull. And the question that will decide your fate, the question that every man must answer, is this. Will you stay obedient inside it, polishing the mirrors of a world that profits from your reflection? Or will you break them and face what's been hidden all along, yourself? The system fears one thing above all, inner sovereignty. A man who no longer needs permission to exist. That's what Christine found in that final instant before the act. A terrible, pure recognition. I am. It wasn't reasoned, it wasn't sane, but it was real. And that's the paradox. Every system that calls itself civilization depends on obedience, yet worships freedom as its myth. The moment you live that freedom, truly live it, you become a threat to the order that claims to protect it. That's why history buries its awakeners under diagnoses. It wasn't just Christine and Leia, it was Galileo, it was Nietzsche, it was Van Gogh, it was every man who looked too closely at the machinery of illusion and saw the ghost inside. Society calls them mad, not because they're wrong, but because they're right too early. Madness in every era is just the name the obedient give to those who see clearly. And the world you live in, the one that claims to be free, depends on your fear of that clarity. They give you comfort to distract you from your cage. They give you screens to replace your eyes. They give you opinions so you'll never have to think. They give you approval so you'll never have to know yourself. That's the real violence of civilization, the quiet killing of the soul through comfort. The Papin sisters refused that comfort. They broke violently, yes, but beneath their horror was an instinct the system could never extinguish. The instinct to belong to no one. That instinct lives in you too, buried, silenced, shamed, but alive. And if you've heard it while listening to this, even faintly, even once, then, and the awakening has already begun. You don't need to kill your masters, you only need to stop believing in them. You only need to withdraw your obedience, your attention, your worship. Because the gaze of power only exists as long as you return it. The mirror only reflects as long as you stand in front of it. Turn away, and it dies. That's the truth they never wanted you to hear. The truth that made Christine whisper, "We're free." Freedom isn't given, it's remembered, and remembering is dangerous because it unravels everything. The Papin sisters didn't die insane, they died awake, and that is what the world still fears. Because one awakened soul, even one, can awaken 1,000 more, and the moment that happens, every master, every institution, every illusion of control begins to crumble. So if you've heard their story and felt something stir inside you, something angry, something alive, something that refuses to kneel, don't bury it, feed it, name it, Honor it. That's not madness. That's remembrance. And remembrance is the first breath of freedom.